Loving Eliza by Ruth and Nordin, Chapter 5. John didn't want to take Eliza to town the following week. What if she went there and decided that she didn't want to come back? What if she met a man that appealed to her? Troy wasn't the only single man in the area. There were a couple of others who'd like nothing more than to take a bride like Eliza home. Like usual, he parked the wagon on the outskirts of the main part of town. And again, he stopped her in front of the church and pointed to it. She gave him her typical no look. Why did she have to keep doing that? Couldn't she just say yes and marry him? Daphne wasn't going to show up. And even if she did, he no longer wanted to marry her. He wanted to marry Eliza. Eliza was beautiful. Eliza was full of life and joy. She thought it was the flowers that brightened up his house, but it was really her that did the trick. He hadn't realized how empty his life had been until she came into it. Now he didn't want to go back to the way things were before. He took her hand and nodded to the church. He even used the expression on his face that she claimed reminded her of an adorable puppy. She seemed to like that expression. She laughed but shook her head. "John, you know I'm not marrying you. As it is, I miss the Sunday worship. Why don't you go to that?" He should have driven her to town on Sunday. Maybe that was why she refused to marry him. But if she knew, if she understood the way people stepped away from him. Not everyone was as kind as Addie or Frank. Some people would rather pretend he didn't exist. It wasn't a situation that he exactly sought out, and being in a small church would force that. He recalled how his family all sat in their own row while he grew up. Some people found reasons to sit away from them. But if Eliza sat with him, it wouldn't be so bad. He nodded and pointed to the church. "I don't believe you," she said. "You really don't stop when you set your mind to something, do you?" He shook his head and motioned to it again. She put her hands on her hips and gave him a scolding look. He looked at the door. Next to it was a sign. He recognized the letter S from what she had taught him. Walking to the sign, he pointed to it and then turned his gaze to her. "That's the word Sunday," she said. "Good." He nodded and tapped the word. "Oh, you'll drive me to church this Sunday?" Excited, he nodded. Then he pointed to himself. "You'll come too?" He grinned. She raised an eyebrow. "You wouldn't be doing this to get me to marry you, would you?" The thought had not occurred to him. He had been thinking about sitting next to her. He liked being close to her. Shaking his head, he walked back to her. "I don't know," she began. "I'd think you'd do anything to get me to agree to marry you." She was right on that assumption, but even if he could speak, he would not tell her that. He just shrugged. "John, you are the sweetest man that I've ever met, but it can't be. There are things about me that you don't know. Believe me, this is for the best." She turned from him and proceeded down the street before he could argue with her. He didn't care what things were in her past. All he knew was how she treated him and how wonderful she was. What more could there be in order for him to love her? "You know what your problem is?" she asked when he caught up to her. "You haven't been around a lot of women. I've seen it before. A man who spent most of his life alone sees the first woman he meets and thinks he's in love with her. Most of those men end up regretting it because they didn't wait for the right one. I'm not the right one, John." So she would marry him today. He wished that Aaron had never talked him into posting an ad for a wife. If he hadn't, then there would be no Daphne, and Eliza would not cling to the notion that he needed to wait for her. Daphne wasn't going to show up, but Eliza had, and he wanted her. After she had cut his hair, she had taken him to a mirror, and she had said that he was the best-looking man that she'd ever seen. That made him feel as if he was really attractive. He never felt that way before. And then she was teaching him how to read and write. That meant she thought he was smart enough to learn. No one else had taken the time to teach him because they thought they'd be wasting their time. Why would he want someone else? Eliza made him feel as if he mattered, and he liked that. He might be a fool in some areas, but this was not one of them. Eliza had the warmest heart of anyone he'd ever met, and he wasn't going to let her go without doing his best to convince her to marry him. She was so completely wonderful. Eliza nudged him in the arm. Blinking, he turned his attention to what she was saying. "Where do you buy paint?" she asked. He took her hand to lead the way, but she shook her head. "You can't do that here," she began. "You don't want people to get the wrong idea." No, he wanted people to get the right idea, and him and Eliza being together was the right idea. How he wished he could say it, but he couldn't because he was mute. Many times he hated his candy cap, and this was one of them. "Just walk and I'll walk beside you," she said. Reluctant, he obeyed. As they neared the center of town, his gaze fell on several groups of people who loitered around the buildings. Most of them refused to look in his direction, though they did take note of Eliza. He glanced at her, wondering if she noticed that she had held their attention, especially that of the men. He stopped in front of old Willie's place and knocked on the door. William Jafferty opened the door and grinned. "Mornin', John. How you doin'? And who's this pretty lady with you?" "I'm Eliza Sweet," she replied, smiling in her usual pleasant way. John really wished that she would not be charming with everyone that she met, but he figured that's the way that she had always been. Still, if they were married, he would feel much better about this. The 40-year-old widower ran a hand through his thinning brown hair and straightened his sloppy clothes. "If I'd known you were going to bring over a lady, I would have shaved," he told John. "I heard you got a fine woman helping you out around your property." He smiled at her. "In a small town, word spreads like wildfire." Great. Now John had to worry about old Willie too. And suddenly, William did not seem so old anymore. John didn't like that either. "Well, I figured that much," Eliza assured him. "But even in bigger places, word gets around." William smiled at her. "My name is William, but people call me Willie. You can too." "Willie is a fine name. I like it." John frowned. Did she like the name John? Of course, old Willie looked flattered. He turned his attention to John. "Did you come by for some paint?" John nodded. "What colors?" Willie directed his gaze to Eliza. "A soft yellow for the kitchen, a light green for the parlor, and," she glanced at John, "did you want green or blue for the bedroom?" John pointed to the sky. "Blue," she said, "like the color of the sky today. It's such a beautiful color, isn't it? And soothing, too." "That it is, ma'am. But I like red, too." He motioned to her hair and winked. "You're the first redhead I've ever seen, which is too bad. It's a great color in a woman." She laughed and fingered the braid that hung over her shoulder. "Well, you certainly have a way with words, Willie. Why, I bet you get a lot of kisses from your wife." He blushed. "Oh, well, Beth Ann passed on to be with the Lord a good 2 years ago." She stopped laughing and grew serious. "I'm terribly sorry to hear that." "Well, she was a fine woman. We had 20 fine years together, and she gave me 3 terrific children. But the Lord has provided, and I'm doing all right. I should probably be looking to get married again." John tensed. Could old Willie be more obvious? "Well, maybe you should put in for a mail-order bride," Eliza replied. "I hear lots of men do that when they're this far out west." John relaxed. "Maybe. Who knows what the future will bring?" He turned to John. "You need any paint or stain for the furniture?" John reached for the wallet tucked into his back pocket. "Well, not this time, John. You took care of that wall for me, and I didn't even have the money to pay you back then. This will make us even. Deal?" John nodded and put his wallet back into his pocket. "Well, that's really nice," Eliza commented. "2 friends helping each other out." Old Willie grinned. "We do what we can to help each other out around here. I'll load the usual amount and extra paint into your wagon while you 2 continue on in town." John nodded again. He was glad old Willie did that for him. Old Willie had the cart to lug those heavy cans around, and he understood that John did not like to park his wagon inside the town limits. So even if the older man was interested in Eliza, he was still a good man. Still, John had no intention of letting that man have her. John was grateful to depart from the man's house. At least ordering lumber from Greg would be safe. Greg was already married. When they reached the lumber store, he motioned to her to go in first through the open door. He waved to Greg, who was setting a stack of freshly cut rectangular boards by the counter. "It's nice to see you, John," Greg called out as he stood up. He sauntered over to them. "You must be Miss Sweet." "I am," Eliza said. I'm Greg Stevens. It's a pleasure to meet you. He turned to John. Do you want the regular order? John held up 2 fingers. You're going to double the order this time? Greg asked. John nodded. Business must be treating you well. Smiling, Greg made his way to the counter and took out his ledger. I can have it delivered tomorrow morning around 10. Does that work? John nodded and pulled out his wallet. Let me mark down the transaction. Greg glanced at Eliza. In business, it's important to keep track of all your expenses and profits. Expenses are what you spend money on, and profits are what you make. John noticed a flicker of irritation cross Eliza's face. Really? She asked. Greg didn't seem to catch the sharp tone in her voice, for he returned to his paperwork. John sensed the tension in the air. Eliza wasn't pleased, but she kept quiet. John wondered what was wrong. He wondered if she would tell him on their way home. He wished he could talk, so he could ask her about it. Greg finished writing and handed him the paper and pencil. All I need is your X, and the total comes to $2, Greg said. John took the pencil and paper and got ready to put the X where he usually did, when Eliza grabbed his arm. Now that's the funniest looking 2 that I've ever seen, Eliza said, obviously upset. She looked at John. Do you know your numbers? Embarrassed, John shook his head. No one had taught him that either. Mr. Stevens, she began, I happen to be literate, and I've learned a couple of things when it comes to business. That is a 3. You are trying to take a 50% profit off of a man's inability to read. Now, I understand that you are using shrewd business sense to rip someone off, but this is illegal, and I don't mind finding the marshal so I can discuss this matter with him. I believe his wife, Charity Grooms, might like to see me again. I did accompany her on the stagecoach ride to this place. John glanced from her to Greg, one of the few people he had believed to be his friend. His face grew red in both anger and shame. Why would Greg do this to him? Greg glared at her for a moment before he turned his attention to John. He smiled. Oh, let me see that. He took the paper and clucked his tongue. I meant to write a 2. Thank you for catching my error, Miss Sweet. John watched as he erased the old number to write the new one in. Now John knew the difference between a 2 and a 3. This was one lesson that he would never forget. Eliza smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I'm teaching John how to read and write. I think it'll be good for his own business. Maybe he can even keep his own ledger and write out contracts too. Then he'd be a real professional. Greg gave a curt nod and set the paper aside. Yes, it'll be good for your business, John. John decided not to give any gestures. Instead, he joined Eliza and left the store. How long had Greg been doing that to him? Like a fool, he just handed Greg his money and let Greg give him the change. He knew that $2 was a fair price. He knew that $3 was too much. But without being able to recognize the symbols and what they meant, he hadn't been able to deduct whether or not Greg was being honest with him. He suspected it happened a lot, and Greg had not known that Eliza could read. John's gaze traveled the length of the street where store owners had opened their doors to waiting patrons. Who else had ripped him off? Eliza let out a low sigh before asking, Where do I buy curtains or have someone make curtains? I've never learned to do any sewing. Addie did that. He pointed down the street to the house that stood next to Melissa Peters' home. But Melissa's not alive, she said. John shook his head. Addie? She guessed. He nodded. He liked that she caught on fast to what he meant, and he liked that she looked out for him. He needed to learn to read and write. He needed to learn his numbers. He had gone along with her plan to teach him, partly because it meant that he would be near her. But now, in light of what had just happened with Greg, he realized this was a necessity. He didn't like being made a fool, and if he could read, he would have caught the error, whether Greg intentionally did it or not. Sadly, he suspected that Greg had done it on purpose. After they went to Addie, who seemed more than happy to make the curtains, they went to the general store, where Eliza picked up some baking supplies. Watching her choose what she would make took his mind off of Greg. He imagined for a moment that she was his wife, and that they would end up going home together, to snuggle, to kiss, and then... I think this will do, Eliza said, interrupting his thoughts. walked over to the counter where Frank tallied their total. When Frank announced the amount, John looked at Eliza, who gave him a slight nod. Comforted in her answer, he handed Frank the money and was reassured once again, which she indicated that Frank gave him the right amount of change. Good. At least he could trust Frank, which was good because he liked Frank, and he didn't want to think ill of him. John lifted the sacks of grocery items and followed Eliza out the door. On their way to the wagon, a couple of men lounging by the post office snickered at John. And that's what they call Beauty and the Beast. John stopped and glared at Michael Reeves and Larry Gordon. His brother Aaron had warned him to stay away from those two, and for the most part he managed. But once in a while, he ran into them and ignored their taunting. Today, after what had just happened with Greg, he was especially sensitive to their comments. "Did I hurt your feelings there, boy?" Michael asked, obviously not caring either way. Eliza halted her steps and turned to them. "Is there a problem, mister?" Larry examined her from head to toe. "Not with you, ma'am. You're downright perfect." She didn't respond. Michael looked at her. "You do know that you're with a retard, don't you?" Her jaw dropped. A what?" "A retard," he slowly said. "A Pullman as pretty as you can find other places to stay," Larry said. "You don't need to be with someone like him." This was exactly what John was afraid of. They were giving her ideas that she did not need to be having. He caught her attention and nodded in the direction of his wagon. The two men laughed. "Just like a pup," Larry said. "He gets so excited when anyone pays him the slightest bit of attention." She placed her hands on her hips and narrowed her eyes at them. "You owe John an apology." "I would apologize if he could understand me, but he can't. It's why he never went to school. The boy is dumb," Larry said. "Like a dog," Michael agreed. "You can't do much better to train him either." She slapped both of them before John had time to blink. Larry put his hands to his cheek, stunned, while Michael bolted to his feet. John quickly stood between her and Michael. The doctor who worked next to the post office ran out of the building. "Hold it right there." As soon as he reached them, the doctor said, "I don't know what's going on here, but you'd better stop it right now. I don't want this kind of conduct while I'm around. I have enough sick people to tend to without you two beating each other up. Now, I suggest you leave the matter be and go home." Once John was sure that Michael would not harm Eliza, he stepped back. The doctor nodded. "Good. Go on home." "Like a good little doggy," Michael hissed. The doctor shot him a warning look, which made him stop his taunting. Eliza shook her head, but obediently walked down the street. The dust kicked at her heels, since she practically ran. John ran after her, and he was glad when they reached the wagon. Now she knew. She knew what most people thought of him. They assumed that if he couldn't talk, then he couldn't think, or even feel. This only added to his shame. He put the bags into the wagon and helped her into her seat. To his surprise, she pulled him closer. Leaning forward, she said, "Don't you mind them. They're not worth your time." He stared into her eyes, noting the tears that formed in them. He nodded. He knew. He always knew. But he was grateful to know that she knew it too. Good. She let go of his hand and faced forward. He got into the wagon. Unlike the first time that he took her to his property, she was quiet. He wondered what she was thinking. At one point, he even nudged her arm so she would look at him before he tapped his head with his finger. "Nothing. I just don't feel like talking," she replied. He decided not to press the issue. She had a right to keep her thoughts to herself, but he sure wished that he could tell her his.